The European Union Copernicus Climate Change Service has confirmed that 2025 was the third warmest year on record, and the global temperatures from the past 3 years have averaged more than 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels. It also confirmed that the past 11 years have been the 11 warmest years on record. It's the first time the level of global warming over a 3-year period has exceeded 1.5 degrees. For more on this, I'm joined on the line by leading climate expert from NUI Maynooth, Professor John Sweeney. John, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Alan.
John, what is the scientific significance of global temperatures averaging above 1.5 degrees centigrade over a 3-year period, even if it doesn't yet constitute a formal breach of the Paris Agreement?
Well, this is the latest in a sequence of reports. The European Copernicus operation has increasingly become the kind of go-to organisation with the decimation of climate and weather records in the United States. And so they're a very authoritative organisation, and what they've come out with is really quite, I suppose it's quite important. Your listeners are probably used to hearing alarm after alarm about climate change. This one is saying really that last year was the third warmest. Now, it wasn't the warmest, and that was because we had a La Nina event rather than an El Nino, which creates warmer conditions globally anyway. But the very fact that it got up there to challenge 2023 is something that's quite surprising. And what it's telling us, I think, is that the rate of climate change is accelerating, that the kind of events that would lead us to exceed the 1.5 degree on a long-term basis is now probably going to happen not in 30 years or 20 years, but by the end of this particular decade. Now, that is quite significant because it's the first of the major tipping points. And we know that even from research earlier last summer, that the first line of vulnerability to an excess of 1.5 degrees is the coral reef systems of the world, the Great Barrier Reefs, the coral islands and so on. They are probably now facing a death sentence, so to speak, from ocean acidification, from the warmer ocean. And that warmer ocean is, I think, the most significant thing to come out of this report, because it's labelling warmer ocean surfaces as one of the causes of the abnormal warmth of last year. And I'm a bit worried about that in one sense, because ever since the Industrial Revolution, the oceans have got us out of trouble. They've absorbed 90% of the excess heat we've been putting into the atmosphere. And if they're now beginning to warm up more quickly than anticipated, it's maybe sending a signal to us that they're not going to function as efficiently as in the past in getting us out of trouble, and that our temperature rise.
And John, if we don't have our oceans to get us out of trouble, have we any cards left to play?
Very few. We're dependent really on the oceans to absorb that heat. And without it, we're going to see changes on land, for example, 10 to 40% extinction of species. We're going to see huge numbers of climate refugees, which we're really not anticipating at the moment. We're going to see food shortages in many parts of the developing world. So all of this coming from Copernicus is saying really that the time has run out for us to start thinking of climate as a long-term issue. The time is really urgent that if we want to avoid that extra tipping points that will now occur, we have to act now. And 1.5, you may say, well, if it gets to 1.6, it's not the end of the world. But this is a non-linear progression where at every 0.1 of a degree accentuates the climate extremes more proportionately, accentuates the droughts, accentuates the floods, accentuates the heat waves. So it's very important that we actually waken up. Okay. And of course in Ireland we're not wakening up at the moment. We're blindly talking about breaking our own climate law for the next 5 years and then being good in the 2030s. That's an untenable position, both legally, morally, ethically. And it's imposing, of course, a disproportionate burden from Ireland's inactivity on the developing world in the south, imposing, if you like, a climate debt on them, which I think is now running at about 5 trillion per year. So we really have to waken up to the fact that unless we pull our weight in this problem and stop thinking it's something for the medium term, then we're going to be facing big problems down the road.
As you've explained there, John, Ireland, we have our part to play, but of course so does the rest of the world. And any time there's the annual COP meetings, there's the aims and priorities and objectives going into those summits. And then once they're all done and dusted, whatever the objectives were tend to be watered down because of lobbying and various other reasons, and very kind of lukewarm outcomes that don't really address the increasing 1.5 degrees centigrade barrier. How much more needs to be done from some of the other leading nations in the world, and how useful are the COP meetings if generally, as I say, the outcome is nowhere near what the hopes were heading into them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's true that COP has been a big disappointment in many respects. We had great hopes for it after Paris in 2015. But I think we shouldn't be just pointing the finger at other countries to get us off the hook. I mean, if you take emissions since 1990, for example, the EU has reduced its emissions by 40%. Individual countries like France, 35%. Non-EU countries like the UK by 50%. Ireland, less than 5%. So, we're not really in the position to point the finger at China or point the finger at India and say, we're the good guys and you're the bad guys. Now, COP, I agree with you completely that, it's a very disappointing outcome both this year and for many years now. I was at COP this year as well in Brazil, and we went, of course, as always, full of optimism and came back really disconsolate. But I think we have to remember that it's the only vestige of multilateralism left where countries can talk to each other on an equal basis. I mean, we've seen a world which has become so polarized now, where multilateralism is more or less denigrated and discarded by some of the big powers. So it's a very important way of getting international agreement, however slow, however small. And it was, for example, international multilateral negotiations which cracked the ozone problem. So we have to hope that countries will see the light and eventually deliver more. But
is there unfortunate timing in that regard, John, that at a time when you need multilateralism and as many countries as possible coming together to really address this issue and stop burying our heads in the sand, the major players, the likes of the United States, Donald Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and he's going to be in power for another number of years until at least November 2028 if things proceed as they should. Who knows what will happen. Russia, China are not on the same page as him. So with the US not playing its part, where do we go from here?
Well, the US, despite Mr. Trump's dramatic gestures, the US has been reducing its greenhouse gas emissions over the years.
But Trump has spoken about dig, baby, dig, which isn't what you want to be hearing when we're trying to address climate change.
But he doesn't actually have the capability to usurp the market. And the market is now saying, don't invest in coal, don't invest in oil. It's far cheaper to invest in renewable energy. And that's why the emissions in America have been falling. And as well as that, there are some individual states in America, there are some very far-sighted governors in America who are doing their own thing, irrespective of the headlines that Mr. Trump is creating. And in terms of China last year produced more in the way of renewable energy than the rest of the world combined. So, we can't point the finger necessarily at other countries as a way of saying we're going to just sit in our hands and do nothing here. We have a moral responsibility, an ethical responsibility to look after the world that we pass on to the next generation. And at the moment, we're passing on a world which is going to be badly damaged. This time last year, For example, we had Stormy Owen in Ireland. We know that this has now cost 30 million euros in insurance claims. It pales into insignificance with the Los Angeles fires this time last year, 60 billion euros in claims. So we're paying a very high cost. The taxpayer is subsidising, for example, in Ireland, fossil fuels to the extent of 4 billion euros per year. That could be much better spent. It's 2 children's hospitals. It's a lot more in terms of the education budget, the health budget. So we have to ask, why are we doing these things when we really should be looking forward to a more sustainable future than we're simply careering towards?
So John, if the world is now effectively living in a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, what changes should societies expect that are fundamentally different from the climate of just 20 or 30 years ago?
Well, the first thing we will see is that the extremes that we're experiencing are going to get worse. We're going to see, as I say, the loss of the world's coral reefs. Get to the Great Barrier Reef in the next 10 years if you have children or grandchildren. We're going to see widespread extinction and species loss. We're going to see more intense wildfires and extreme wildfires, extreme storms, extreme cyclones, dying rainforests. We're going to see the loss of the ice sheets, not in the immediate future. We're going to see the gradual loss, irreversible, of Greenland and West Antarctica, with the dramatic sea level rises that will be accompanied by for countries like Ireland. We're going to see a risk to food security in the world as higher temperatures lead to crop failures elsewhere. We're going to see chronic water shortages, and we're going to see people dying more from heat-related illnesses. We saw a lot of that last year, and we're going to see increasing conflict as well as a result of competition for dwindling resources. We've seen a lot of that conflict in places like the Sahel Belt in Africa. We're going to see problems of mental health. We're going to see a whole host of problems which we really can avoid if we get our act together in the short term. So the future is bleak, not to put too fine a point on it, from this Copernicus report. And it's a warning for us to wake up and actually tackle this problem and not simply put it to the back of our mind.
And if we do wake up, John, and take our heads out of the sand and start to make the changes that are necessary ASAP, what will those changes look like? Obviously, as many countries as possible moving towards greener energy and so on. Air travel, could that look very different given the amount of fuel that's used by planes? And I suppose people will worry about that in Ireland because we are an island nation.
Indeed. We have to look, for example, at more sustainable forms of air travel, either with sustainable biofuels or better powered battery-powered systems. We have to look at reducing our own imprint in terms of our car-borne society within Ireland. We have to look at changing our diet away from the very high carbon-intensive beef and dairy, which we know is not good for us anyway, towards a much more diversified system of diet. And that has consequences for our farming systems, but the consequences are also quite good in terms of improvements in water quality, improvements in air quality, less ammonia, less methane. So, we have to balance the issues there. And if we get it right, then we have a more sustainable world of warmer homes, of more sustainable transport, of more sustainable forms of diet, and a better competitive Ireland at the end of the day. Because if we don't act, we're going to be in the slow lane in the future compared to countries that do act. And that will mean a loss of competitiveness for a country like Ireland. So we have to balance all of those things and hopefully get the measure of climate change in the short term and not simply downgrade it the way that we've seen in the public media, the way we've seen in the political prognostications, even within Ireland, in the past year or so.
And I'll finish on that particular point, John, because it isn't just media and those sectors of society that you mentioned. It's some of the general public. Maybe they're sceptics about climate change and that things are exacerbating in terms of that particular issue. I'll just read you out a text that's come in from Morning Focus listener Mike on 086 1800 964. He's pointing out that the summer in 1914 in Ireland was 39 degrees. He says climate is a 100-year cycle, and indeed 112 years ago average temperatures of the summer in Ireland were 32 degrees Celsius. It exceeded 38 degrees in direct sun, and there were temperatures of over 39 degrees reported in direct sunlight in some areas during that 1914 heat wave. What would you say to his point that climate is a 100-year cycle?
Well, it's very easy to cherry pick a year or cherry pick an individual warm event and draw a conclusion from that in terms of 30-year averages or in terms of long-term trends in climate. You can't argue with thermometers, and thermometers will show the odd extreme historically. Many times in the past, our temperature measuring devices were not as well scientifically located, if you like, as at present. But you're arguing with me here, and we've never had a temperature in Ireland in the shade above 33 degrees centigrade. So, if you're looking at something above that, you're looking at rather dubious records, and I wouldn't be betting the bank on them. OK, we do have to leave it there. John, thanks so much for being with us this morning. Thank you. That's Professor John Sweeney there, leading climate expert from NUI Maynooth on Morning Focus.